Welcome to Survivor Space and this Survivor Circle session with my friend Rick Goodwin from Men in Healing. Pleased to welcome Rick back today to talk about Ego States 101, a model of understanding trauma. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Rick.
Well, right away. Okay. Hi, folks. Excuse me. Good to be back in Survivor Space, and yeah, we've got a significant topic. I mean, significant in the sense that it's in all my years of being a clinician and then a trainer on trauma. To me, this is the the encompassing model, not only to understand how people tick, and that was really the origins of it, but it has such great application, not only to understand trauma, but also to give some insight, some guidance in terms of the process of recovery from trauma. So one model, speaking to both trauma and trauma recovery. Of course, I'm jumping ahead of myself, but that's the topic today, and I'm keen to get into that. Before I do, though, as usual, we need to give acknowledgement where acknowledgement is worthy, and here we want to thank the good folks in the U.S. Department of Justice providing the funding grant to allow Survivor Space to be a resource for one and all. So, folks, this is your tax dollars in action. And again, we give thanks and praises to Zero Abuse being sponsored by the U.S. Department of Justice. Okay. So this is going to be a bit of a storytelling in terms of the introduction of this topic. On the top of your screen, you'll see Freudian slippers, ha ha ha. The joke of one of many aspects of Freud's teachings over the years, Freud being the granddaddy of Western psychology. He was an Australian physician, turn of the century in terms of the 19th into 20th century. So his teachings are, a good 125 years old, maybe a little less than that. And we're going to be working on a riff of Freud's work today. And anyways, just to say about these slippers, you can buy these on the internet. I mean, you can buy anything on the internet. But we're going to use the notion of the Freudian slip, the notion that we not just work consciously in this world. For example, here I am talking to my screen, believing that there are other people behind their screens listening to me. That's my conscious awareness, and my subconscious awareness is kind of like the Freudian slip. Oh, I'm not aware I'm doing that until someone points it out, or maybe I see myself on replay or something like that. Oh, Rick, you clear your throat a lot. What's that about? That's what we're going to be getting into today. Our conscious selves, our subconscious selves, and how we can bring the subconscious to awareness. This approach of using psychological theory in terms of insight and understanding in people's lives, we could call that a psychodynamic approach. There are many approaches in psychology. Psychodynamic is only one approach, but it tends to be the most dominant approach that we use at our clinic and when we provide mental health services to men. And of course, what we're looking at today is trauma. How does this apply to the trauma world? So let's get into that. Now, the story begins not only with Freud, but with a fellow named of Eric Berne. And Eric Berne was what was he now? I think he was a medical doctor, yes, in his own right. And like many people who was influenced by Freud's teachings, he wanted to become a member of Freud's inside circle. So Freud had a real following of people from Carl Jung onwards, and people wanted to, just like people do at a rock concert, they want to be up close. They want to be in that circle, that inside circle. And Freud did have a very identifiable inside circle. And Byrne, the young researcher himself, kept trying to get into the inside circle and got rebuffed, and tried again to get in the inside circle and got rebuffed, until at one stage in Byrne's life he said, "Well, the heck with that. I'm just going to carve out my own approach of understanding how people tick." Now, if you've ever done any following of Freud, in some ways, how can we, in Western society, we all know these little bits and pieces of Freud, even if we've never taken a psychology class. But you may recall that there are three aspects to a person, to a personhood, to a psyche. Um, if you remember terms like that, Freud was very big that, as human beings, we are social animals, not unlike other animals on this planet. And we're wired for certain things. And, we're wired for what we could call instinctual drives. So Freud divided the notion of having instincts in two ways. He talked about the instinct for sex, and we all know Freud was a big sex guy. Called that eros. And he also said there's a parallel instinct that we had as people to be oriented towards death and destruction, and that was called thanatos. So again, Freud believed that we were very much influenced by our instinctual drives. Now today, luckily we don't have to get into instinctual drives, but just to say that that was part of Freud's notion of the psyche. Another notion of the psyche he had was the notion of superego. Superego was a sense of a shared morality that people have, no matter where you go on this planet, regardless of culture and race and things like that. We seem to, as people, have a inborn sense of how to organize, of how to get along, how to get things done. And that was seen as more of a moral structure. So superego is that shared moral structure, whether conscious or not. For today's purposes, we don't have to get into superego. What we're really keen on today, because this is what Byrne was keen on, was a middle slice, the slice of our psyche that holds an intermediary role between instincts and superego. And Freud called this the ego. And again, there's that conscious self as well as subconscious self. That's what we're keen on. That's what Byrne wanted to zero in terms of his pioneering work in psychology. And that's, in part, what we're going to be looking at today. So I'm going to just jump ahead to how Byrne presented this. We could come back to this image because there are certain things going on here. But this notion of what Byrne carved out in psychology land, it goes by the name of ego state theory. That's a name we tend to use because it allows us to think more intrapsychically, meaning what goes on within a person, how they see the world and how they interact with the world. But if we saw it more interpersonally, like the picture here, the term based on Byrne's teachings would be transactional analysis. So whether you're a student of transactional analysis or a student of ego state theory, it's really coming to the same components of ourselves and what makes up ourselves. So Byrne said there's three parts of ourselves. And I'll start off with the middle piece first. The A stands for adult. And adult, parent, and child ego states have nothing to do with one's chronological age. So let's just say that and get that one out of the way. Doesn't matter how old you are necessarily to identify these parts of ourselves. So the adult, let's start with adult. The adult ego state are the thoughts, feelings, and behavior that we apply in the present tense. It's how we are directly engaging with the world. It occurs in the present tense. It doesn't occur our worries about yesterday or anxieties about tomorrow. No, it occurs right in the present. And we could say the adult ego state is perhaps the most primary ways we understand ourselves. Most of us, most of the time, believe we're an adult ego state. If we're in adult ego state, we are pretty rational beings. We're anchored in the present tense. And by being anchored in the present, we can tap into, I don't know, like the 101 skills and awarenesses that you and I all have because we're big people. We've learned stuff. And even when we don't know stuff, we've learned the skill of asking for help. And so we're pretty resourced when we're in adult ego state. If we're in adult ego state, we have feelings, but the feelings are proportionate to the experiences we're having. So from stubbing your toe to someone blocking your driveway with their car, we may have emotional responses in situations, but they're not wildly out of proportion, nor are they stifled. It's a proportionate expression. And that's going to be important for us to attend to as we go further today. Okay, adult ego state. Let's say another way of saying ego state is our operating system. So an adult operating system. And just as a reminder, when you read ego here, in any of these understandings of ego states, it's not like using the word ego, like, oh, Rick must have a big ego for talking about a topic like this. It's ego is again that conscious self and subconscious self. If you believe that you live today is a Monday, July 22nd, your chances are you're an adult ego state. If you know that this webinar only goes for so long and then it's going to be over, that's being in conscious adult ego state. Now, if I asked you to pay attention to your big toe on your left foot and maybe give it a wiggle just to demonstrate that, chances are you weren't aware of your big toe on your left foot until I mentioned that. And then your subconscious awareness of your toe came to consciousness, you gave it a wiggle, and then you made some conclusion about how your toe is doing. So subconscious can be brought to consciousness. This is where Byrne wanted to put his emphasis on and understanding people and how people change. Okay, assuming you're with me, of course, there's two other ego states we've got to pay attention to here. We're not always an adult, even though we may think we are. So let's look at the child ego state next. The child ego state is the first way that you and I carved out our understanding of the world. You know, once we, from the day we were born, we had to comprehend what we were as entities, and then recognizing that, oh, these other things around me, oh, this entity over here is called mother, or maybe this one over here is called father, or whoever. And it was depending then on how the baby, how we liaised with these entities to get our needs met. You know, babies are wired for survival. And so that was the most fundamental learning, how to get their needs met. And from those early conceptualizations, from birth onwards. We could probably consider that in vitro or in utero experiences also would be part of this. The child learns in a very rudimentary way thoughts, feelings, and behavioral responses from those early years. So in our early childhood, we had our own operating system, much different than the adult operating system. Child operating system is inherently self-oriented. It's the only way that children really learn how to formulate themselves in this world. It's all from their own experience outwards. So at one stage, the little person may have associated by making the sound like wah with having a full diaper, and learned that by making that noise, God got the little guy a fresh diaper. And that, if we could ask the baby at that time, the baby made that happen. Again, self-orientation. Children cannot see things objectively. They don't have the rational and intellectual comprehension of things like that. It's all from their own eyes. So another time they make a noise, they got a warm bottle of milk, and they could conclude, how powerful am I, that little guy, to make that happen? And then another situation may occur when the little guy realizes by turning up the corners of his mouth, brought on this warm cooing response by these big entities. Again, the child's understanding made that happen. So, all to be said, by the time we're 4 or 5 or whatever, we've got a fairly carved out way of understanding the world. And we call that child ego state. Now, just because we're whatever age we are watching this webinar, we're well beyond those years. But that doesn't mean that ego state has left you. It's still there. It's not necessarily your dominant ego state, your dominant operating system, but it's still with you. And as life has it, those earlier emotions, let alone behaviors, let alone thoughts, can sneak up on us unexpectedly, and we may alter ourselves. So I'm going to use an example. I'm going to pick on Becky, as I like to do on these talks. And Becky, I report to Becky in terms of my contributions to survivor space. So I consider her boss. Maybe she doesn't like that word, but she is in a position of authority over me. And let's say Becky and I worked in the same building. So one morning, I'm coming in for 9 o'clock or whatever. I'm taking off my coat. I'm really just interested in getting another cup of coffee before I do anything else. And a colleague of mine says something like, "Oh, Rick, Becky wants to see you right away." And I go, "Oh, that's kind of weird. What's that about?" And my colleague says, "I don't know, but she just said as soon as you get in there to go see her." Okay, so I hang my coat up, and then I'm starting to walk to her office. But as I walk to her office, I'm feeling different. Maybe I'm feeling in my body a little restless. Maybe emotionally, I'm feeling a little nervous, apprehensive, and anxious. And in my head, I might be racing in terms of trying to understand why Becky wants to see me. And if you've ever been in that situation, and I've certainly been in that situation, I start feeling small. And what we can understand this is that the person is shifting out of adult ego state into something more historic, more aged, more back in times, perhaps as a child. And by the time I get to Becky's door and Becky, hi, I hear that you want to see me. My behavior might even be different. I may be stammering. I may not be using certainty in my tone of voice. I maybe sound, again, a bit bewildered. Not really articulating myself all that well. And she says, yeah, hi, Rick, good morning. Yeah, I really needed to see you because you handed in your expense claim, but you didn't sign it. And the bookkeeper's coming by any minute now to pick up the financial work. So here you go. And I go, okay. And I pull out my pen and I sign the form and I say, is that it? And Becky said, well, yeah, that's what I needed you for, have a good day type of thing. And it might even take me a while to get back to my desk to settle before I feel normal again, back to adult. So what we can consider that then is a replay happened. A replay that I went from adult ego state to this archaic operating system of child. And I was in child for a while before I came back down. Okay. Child ego state, not a very functioning ego state. Really, child ego states do not truly function in this world. We only function in adult. Okay, but there's another ego state we haven't touched yet. So let's get into that. When you got older in your childhood, and now 6, 7, 8 on, you couldn't just rely upon child ego state to understanding the complexity of this world. You had to take in more. You had to take on more at such a rapid rate because we live in a pretty complicated world, and it's intent, you have to survive it. You have to understand how it works. You have to negotiate with it. It's all part of socialization. So no longer could you just rely upon your internal self-orientation. You had to find a shortcut to it. And the shortcut that we take when we're of that age is that we mimic what we learn from our parents or authority figures, if we weren't brought up by our parents, whoever we brought us up. And those thoughts and those feelings and behaviors we take in. We take their thoughts and feelings, behavior, and we take them in to make them our own. Now, if you're a follower of Gestalt therapy, you would say, yes, in this in this situation, children tend to swallow things whole. And that means that as a kid, when your mom or your dad or whoever said or did things in front of you, you weren't able to be critical about, I like this aspect of my father, but I don't like that aspect of my father. You didn't have the critical reasoning at that time. You just could swallow things whole. So basically then, our other ego state then is informed by and led by these past learnings. And we can call that parent ego state. So again, conscious, yes. Subconscious, yes. Just like child ego state, the parent ego state is also not truly functioning. Might sound functioning, but it's not. It's often replays that go on that we learned back then, and now because of a situation, might be a situation that brings on anxiety or stress or surprise, we revert to these older, archaic ego states. So I'm going to appeal to all the parents who are watching this, and I'm going to say, your experience may even be similar to my experience. That, well, when my kids were smaller and they were doing things that children tend to do, whether that be making a mess or not putting away dirty dishes or whatever. There are times I respond to that situation by going with them. And as I'm kind of chewing them out for whatever, dishes left out in the living room, any example will do, I realize I'm sounding like who? I'm sounding like my old man and how he would discipline myself and my brothers when I was a kid. That was an experience I took in as a kid. I swallowed it whole. So not just what he said, how he was acting, the tone of his voice. I made that my own. And then lo and behold, many years later, I respond to my kids in similar ways that my father responded to me as a child. There we go. 3 ego states, only one that functions, and the rest, the other 2 we can call relics. They look like ego states, they look like they can function, but they can't. It would be like, I don't know, you and me going to a junkyard. And I say, hey, look at the red car over there. And you say, well, Rick, you're kind of right. I mean, it's got 4 tires and it's got a steering wheel and, what have you. But it doesn't run. It doesn't operate. It's a relic. It's a junker. And yet, this is all part of ourselves. Okay, I'm going to need to move along here, but that's the basics of ego state work. Now, here's the same notion, but just presented in a bit different way. And the key difference here is the dotted line. Anything above the dotted line suggests that the individual is anchored in the present, in the here and now, which is the only time we can truly problem solve, get things done, what have you, where we truly show our capacity, our knowledge, and our creativity to respond to any situation. However, we're not always like that. The time when I had to go to Becky's office, the time where I'm chewing out my kids for making that mess, I'm really operating in the past. It's not, even though the behavior is in the present, it truly is a response I'm having internally of living in the past. And that's a distinction here. Now, right here, we could say, let's slow down a little bit and let's see how we can understand the role of the impact of, say, child abuse or neglect or other traumas one may experience in life, and how that may shift this presentation of the structure of ego state. So let's take two individuals, and I'll continue using a male reference because of my work in working with men on mental health issues. Let's take, I don't know, let's take 2 20-year-olds. And the first 20-year-old grew up in a family that was functional. It wasn't a family troubled with dysfunction or addiction or abuse. The children in this family were loved. Parents demonstrated what we could call secure attachment. And here I'm just holding my arms like I'm holding a little baby. The parents were attuned to the children so that if there was any need that the child suggested or even had a look on his face, the mom or dad, whoever, would say, oh, hey, honey, what's going on? Is something on your mind? Because they'd be attuned to a simple facial expression. There would be close proximity between the caregiver and the child. Let's say that boy, that 20-year-old, experienced no harms in the family or outside the family. And now he's a 20-year-old in front of you. Well, that 20-year-old is going to be pretty anchored in the here and now, in the sense that their muscle memory is anchored in the adult ego state. That's where they tend to spend most of their time. Now, like anyone else, they will periodically dip down into these relic parent or child ego states, but those dips will be infrequent and they won't be that long lasting until the person comes back and they're fully functioning adult, because that's where their muscle memory is. Okay, but there's another 20-year-old that we need to concern himself. And now the second fellow, same age, but you know what? His family wasn't demonstrating the love and connection and attunement and proximity of the first family. Now, the second man's family was disorganized, dysfunctional. Needs weren't always met. Safety wasn't always assured. Might be troubled with addiction, troubled with abuse, troubled with other issues. He's also 20 years old. Well, we could look at his profile. He would still have these three components, but his muscle memory, the second fellow, would be anchored in the past. More times than not, he may be in parent or child ego state, because that's where he's most familiar with. That's where he keeps going back to. His time in being present and rational and adult ego state will be there, but not necessarily the most dominant part of his time. And so that second fellow is going to have a lot more work to do. And we know that on a certain level, but this model now shows in what way. Because to live a happier, healthier life, we need to have a strong adult ego state. And we have to recognize times that we're dropping below the dotted line in order to catch ourselves, attend to our needs, and do whatever it takes in terms of understanding or self-care or compassion to get back to adult ego state. So two guys, same age, much different profiles, using ego state theory. Okay, I'm hoping you're still with me. And we're going to keep going along here, just adding a little bit more depth and dynamic to this model of understanding. Okay, now we're going to make it a step more confusing, but I'm going to say it may also be clarifying for you too. So Eric Berne and his followers now looked at the more complexity around the three ego states. And now we can look at where people get into trouble. Now, first of all, to say, look at adult first. Adult ego state has no complexity to it. There's no positive or negative side to it. There are no components to adult, because if we are truly an adult, we're anchored in the present. We have all our skills and capacities to act on. We're going to make our best decisions. We're an adult. No judgment about any of that. Where we get into trouble, of course, is when we're not an adult. So for both parent and child, you can see on the screen things that are written in green. And by saying green, or having those words in green, means that they're non-problematic. They make life rich. They make life interesting. It's not rational. It doesn't hold the same rationality as adult ego state. But, when we have these components that are positive in our life, we don't really even need to tend to them, because that's part of living a good life. So let's look at child. You'll see the green writing, being pro-social, being polite, and being cooperative. Those are wonderful skills to have. We have to have those skills. As children, we all learn to sit in rows in kindergarten or what have you, and we learn to take turns and clean up our messes. In some ways, that fits with the notion of the adapted child. Because as children, we have to learn how to adapt to this world. Those green components, it's not going to be problematic. It gets problematic, though, when the adapted child has to bend over backwards to conform. That here we have words fearful or guilty as being emotional consequences of being adapted. So it's not a problem for the child to learn to take turns, but if we would say that same child, when they get home that after school, and they're counting how many beers dad had, or the tone of mom's voice, and that kid is now having to walk on eggshells, well, that's an adapted child, and that's problematic. That's going to be harming to the child. So again, it's the shadow aspects that we need to attend to ourselves. Same for free child, being playful, spontaneous, loving, lovely energy, not really rational. We can't place it under adult, but makes life worth living. However, if that child or that adult who is still holding that child energy is constantly rebelling, being always selfish and egocentric, grandiose, narcissistic, inconsiderate to others. Well, we know we've got a lot of problems with that kind of behavior in society. That would be the shadow of free child. Now we can say the same thing with parent as well. We go up to the critical parent. Well, parent energy, regardless of your age, can be protective, constructive, guiding each other. Maybe at the Zero Abuse Project, when they have a new hire, one of the managers takes that person under their wing to show them, oh, this is where you get coffee, and this is how you submit your pay invoice, and here's where the office supplies are. That's guiding energy. We can't truly place it under adult because it comes out of a love or a connection or concern. Not an issue though. It's not an issue if we look at a nurturing parent and talk about being caring and being unconditional and compassionate. Again, lovely stuff. We don't have to worry about that. It's the shadow areas of that work that get us into trouble. So critical parent, let's go back to critical parent. The shadow area is persecuting, shaming, blaming, controlling, dismissive. You can almost see the parent figure wagging their finger at the child. This is very harmful to children, as we all know. Similarly, the shadow of the nurturing parent, if that nurturing parent energy is so suffocating, rescuing, smothering, invasive, not letting others have their relative space and autonomy, harmful things will happen. So now we've got a model of understanding ourselves and how, even though most of the time we'd like to think we're an adult, we may see parts of ourselves expressed in all of these domains, knowing that we'll get into trouble mostly in the areas of red, not the areas of green. And there are particular patterns that stem from being victims of child abuse. So I mentioned the notion of conforming, the child learning to live and walk on eggshells because home was not necessarily safe. And that pattern continues on into adulthood as that person, whatever age, may revert back to child ego state and feel overwhelmingly fearful or guilty at times. And the same thing for critical parents. Critical parent ego state, the shaming, blaming behavior, well, that's also a component of what children learn when they receive those messages. They take it, they swallow it whole, and now you have that adult, possibly even a parent, replicating the shaming, blaming of others, like they have been shamed and blamed. And this is part of trauma. All right, we're going to keep moving on here. I want to just flag a couple issues of anger just as a working example. If an individual has non-proportionate anger, sorry, if it's proportionate anger, it would be being adult. Non-proportionate anger, it's going to end up in two ways. One is going to be this rebellious side of the free child. The person is going to sound much different than the anger of the shaming and blaming coming from the persecutory element of critical parent. This is how we need now to diagnose ourselves, diagnose others in terms of how they are functioning and where they're coming from. So that's, again, part of the work of providing therapy, but it's also part of the work of understanding oneself when you receive therapy too. Now, you might say, why the heck would I want to do all this work? This sounds kind of, I don't understand the purpose. Well, let's talk about the purpose. Often, when people present themselves, say in a helping relationship, as saying, I've got some problems here, can you help me with them? Using our knowledge of ego state theory, we can talk about that more often than not, the presenting problems are there because there's a contamination of their adult rational self in areas of their life they have yet to understand or explore or comprehend, influenced by child ego state or parent ego state. So the image there on your left shows that the dark areas are the contamination. And so the therapeutic process needs to help work with the individual to tease these components apart in their life. If we can do that, then that individual can decide, oh, well, these are parts of my child ego state or adult ego state I still want to hold on to. And then we can talk about an integration process that brings us all to consciousness and their conscious awareness, and no longer kind of being unaware of things, they're consciously aware of things. But let's use a couple examples just to make this really, really, really clear. You probably know people, maybe this is you yourself. I've known people certainly who are, in whatever way they express it, they're superstitious. They have a belief structure that, oh, if you live on the 13th floor of a building, that's a problem, or you don't say things like that because then you can encourage I forget the expression, the judgment of, you say that to you. Anyways, you don't step on a crack or you break your mother's back, kind of thing. Okay, there are people in this world that are superstitious. What is superstition? We can say, well, first of all, is it a rational, here and now thought and behavior? And we probably would conclude quite quickly that no, that's not. It seems childlike. It's like an old belief that they got internalized, and they're not really thinking in that rationally through. They're just avoiding that crack, avoiding the 13th floor, avoiding whatever in life. That's unaware. And if we can help that individual pull apart the adult to the making the child energy, the child ego state more conscious, more aware, then the person can decide whether they want to continue their life being superstitious or not. We can look at another example of contamination between the adult and parent. And let's say you grew up in a family where your mom, your dad, whoever brought you up were bigoted. They were bigoted people. They had prejudicial opinions of those people over there because of whatever issue. You know, their race, their culture, their what they look like, whatever. Okay. As a child, you swallowed that whole. And lo and behold, you now hold prejudicial, bigoted views. That is contamination or being unaware between the overlap of adult and parent. What can that person do? Well, in the therapeutic process, the counselor can work with that person to separate the rational adult from these particular views that came from somewhere. They weren't born with them. So they would have to examine where those views came from, decontaminate those views, and then it's up to the individual whether they still want to integrate any of that again. If they did, it would be with conscious awareness. So that's the shtick of providing therapy using this model. We want people to become aware. We want people to bring integration to their experience. All right. Here we were talking again about anger, just as an example. 3 types of anger. Okay, if I was, I don't know, let's say I was, had an issue with Becky. Becky, who's my superior. Let's say Becky was late on the call today. She wasn't, but I'll use this as an example. Thank you, Becky. I could say, Becky, I thought the plan was that we were supposed to be on the call 10 minutes before, we'd go. And boy, it was kind of cutting it close today, Becky, I was a little concerned, a little frustrated. Maybe in the future, can we both commit to being 10 minutes on before the call, before the webinar? That might be as angry as I can be with Becky, because I'm an adult ego state. If I'm at an adult ego state, I can describe what I want. I'm fairly rational. My emotions are proportionate. Her being late by 5 minutes didn't, no one died, right? I don't need to be big in terms of asking for what I want. However, it would be a different interpretation if I sounded like this. Becky, it's not fair. I mean, like you expect me to be on time and be all ready for this webinar, but you just do what you want, and then then I'm just left hanging here. And I'm playing that up a little bit, but you might hear the child voice and all that. I'm protesting, I'm pouting. I'm drawing attention to my needs. My emotions are bigger than the situation may warrant. If that was how I presented myself to Becky, child ego state would be the diagnosis. And then again, I appreciate you being here, Becky, for me to use this example. If I responded to Becky in a way that sounded like, Becky, you call yourself a manager and you just can't even do the basic things to have people report to you. I mean, like, where did you learn that style of management? I wonder, geez. If I responded to her that way, the tone, the being dismissive, kind of pointing my finger at her. I'm not being an adult, that's for sure. It's a different anger than child ego state. We could only conclude it's parent ego state. Where I would be operating from. So here we are starting to get some play now of how we can understand certain situations, figuring out, well, where can we map people appropriately in ego state work? And keep in mind, because this is a teaching model of therapy, some people call it a very democratic model of therapy. Not only if I was your counselor, I would be thinking the stuff through, but you could start over time realizing that, I feel really, my emotions are really big in this. What's going on? And I can then reflect on myself. I can say, well, what happened right before I felt these big emotions? And if I'm starting to feel big emotions, I may have the wherewithal then to say, hey, I need a little breather, find myself to get back to adult before I present any issues with Becky or anyone else I might be in conflict with. So there you go. This is kind of the overview of ego state work. Ego state work wasn't designed for trauma, but it is a wonderful model for engaging in understanding trauma and engaging in trauma recovery, because it looks at these parts to ourselves. And by looking at these parts of ourselves, we can understand where we're coming from. And of course, if we can understand where we're coming from, we can now then figure out where we want to go in life. So, Becky, this is now my presentation is formally over. I'll turn off my screen share and see where we're at and wrapping up with the discussion.
Great, thank you, Rick. We do have a couple people that joined us after the top of the hour. So if anyone has any questions or comments they would like to share, please feel free to do that, and we'll give you some time to think about it. So Rick, this seems to be pretty, I mean, really important knowledge to have, even if you've not experienced trauma. Like this seems to be something that would be beneficial just for people to learn as they mature and navigate the world. And I don't remember ever learning anything like this until I got into the realm of mental health or advocacy.
Yeah, this work came up in waves. and which is true for a number of things in psychology. His Burns' work was maybe mostly in the 50s, early 60s. The momentum of his work was more in the late 60s and 70s. Then I'm going to say the attention in the Western world in psychology dropped from this model, and yet now doing trauma work, as we're all trying to figure out the best ways to work with folks to help them in their trauma recovery and to help them learn how to guide themselves in trauma recovery. I believe there's a resurgence of this model because it's a very teachable model. You don't, all the skills aren't always with the therapist. After teaching the model, people then can learn how to guide themselves. We call that mapping. Oh, I'm feeling like I got a big emotion going on here. Oh, what's that about? What's the replay going on here? Whatever's going on, I need to look after myself, or else I'm going to get into trouble if I just start speaking my mind. And right there, we've got a number of core components to help that guide, to help guide that person in their recovery. Now, there's a lot more places we could go with this model. We obviously don't have time today, but if anyone is looking at the menu of past webinars in Survivor Space, you may see ones speaking of the drama triangle. Or the trauma triangle, which are wonderful, intriguing applications of this notion of ego state theory.
Still don't have any questions in the chat, but there's still a few minutes if folks have any questions or thoughts they'd like to share. So we had a comment. My therapist told me my mother is a part perpetrator and that I need to accept it, but I just can't seem to be angry at my mom.
That's an interesting observation. Yeah, I don't want to analyze the person's comment too much. I would say this though, in any relationship, even the healthiest of relationships, anger can come up. Anger does come up. Anger is a very, like all emotions, it's a useful emotion. It's, you can say the purpose of anger is to help assert our boundaries and boundary violations. If Becky and I worked in the same office, she walked in my office, took my stapler, didn't return it, I'd go, hey, Becky, where's my stapler? Because there was a bit of a boundary violation there. She didn't ask permission. She didn't tell me when she was going to return the stapler. So then I would say, this notion of not feeling angry with somebody, you may want to ask yourself, but curious about that. Curiosity, by the way, the only ego state that one can be curious is as adult. Only in the adult they can be curious, not in the other two, because they're just replays. So the curious question would be, well, why would that be? Why don't I hold anger towards this person in my life, though anger is a component of all relationships. And then you may wonder about being adapted. Was it a pattern that maybe learned a long time ago to the point that you aren't even conscious of it? That maybe expressing anger to one's mother was not safe for you. Expressing anger could have got you into deeper trouble. Maybe by expressing emotions like anger could have led to punishments or abuse. Well, then part of the detective process would be to recognize that this pattern might be stemming from child ego state. It's not rational. It's not anchored in the here and now. It's a hangover, a replay from many years ago. And then with the adult conscious mind to start shifting that pattern. So that would be one way of approaching that using ego state theory. I hope that's of some help.
Great. Thank you, Rick. Had another comment just thanking you for sharing and that this was helpful.
Okay, you're more than welcome. I find this such a helpful process. When I sit down with clients, I kind of go into a bit of a teaching mode, kind of like I was with all of you today, and that seems to stick. You know, like I might write the PAC on a piece of paper and then make some examples under each, and then the following week he comes back and he's got further insights around patterns he's starting to detect in himself. And I think that makes for good therapies when you get stuff that are real truly takeaways. You know, you can go back home with that notion, you can work it in your own life, you can journal on it, you can talk to your loved ones about it, to understand these patterns. The more understanding, the more we can change.
Great. Thank you, Rick. And one additional comment. Thank you. It gave me a broader spectrum of thinking.
You're more than welcome. This notion of parts, you know, we can say Freud was the original person who thought of our personality as in parts. And if you follow trends in psychology, there's something called internal family systems, which also is a model of parts of ourselves. I think when we look at the notion of parts, it helps us identify which parts that we carry are still carrying the wounds from our childhood. And not all of you, of course, is wounded, but there may be troublesome parts. And if we can apply then the strengths we have in certain parts of our life, like the adult ego state, will allow us then to work on these troubling parts with precision. And as an adult, you know that, well, I could read a book on this. I can talk to my counselor about this. You know, that my support group, I could bring this up to my support group onwards and onwards. That's demonstrating the resources you have in adult ego state to address problematic issues that are no doubt somewhere in your child ego state or parent ego state.
Great. Thank you, Rick. And I know we've got just a couple minutes left until the hour, so I wanted to give you a chance to talk about online support groups.
Hey, thank you, Becky. Okay, this message goes out to any male identifying viewers today who believe that they are a survivor of childhood sexual abuse or adult sexual assault. So, a branch of Zero Abuse Project is 1 in 6, and the website is number one, in6.org, and that entity is dedicated to working with male survivors of childhood sexual abuse, adult sexual assault. 5 days a week, on weekdays, you have to look at the website to see the schedule. We offer online support groups, which means that you can attend free of charge a 90-minute group session. You don't have to give us your name. You just people identify with nicknames, where there's group support, obviously, and psychoeducation. Teaching's kind of like this. And sometimes we do more support group work, and sometimes we flip into teaching mode. But the idea is to be a resource for men on their healing journey. So if that speaks to you and you're male identifying, come on out, check out the schedule, figure out a catchy nickname for yourself, and give it a go. We know that the first session can evoke a fair degree of anxiety, especially if people haven't talked about this issue before. But it only takes a session or two for the guys to feel kind of at home. And over time, getting to know the other guys of that particular session, as everyone shares a goal of learning to live, to have a happier and healthier life. So, so there's a plug. Come on out, and thanks, Becky, for reminding me of that.
Thank you, Rick. And I put a link to the schedule in the chat, so you
Ah,
can just click
lovely.
there and see the the date and time that works best for you or someone that you may know who could benefit from it.
Good enough.
So thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you, Rick, for another great presentation. I always learn from you, and I know other folks do as well.
Stop it then.
Well, thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we hope to not see you again soon because we don't see folks on this, but hope you'll join us again soon. Take care, everybody.
Bye, folks.